Hey guys, hopefully you can hear me. I thought I would read a book for you today. So I have 1996 Gloria Naylor, a novel by the author of The Women of Brewster's Place. So this is going to be a recording of her book. So here we go. 1996, Gloria Naylor. For Sterling, who not only believed me, but believed in me. Thank you. The weapons of tomorrow will not only be aimed at hitting your body, they will also be aimed at your mind. Quote by Armin Victorian. 1996. Chapter 1. I didn't want to tell this story. It's going to take courage, perhaps more courage than I possess. But they left me no alternatives. I am in a battle for my mind. If I stop now, they'll have won. And I will lose myself. One of the problems I have is where to begin and how to begin. I guess as with most good stories, I should start at the beginning. And as with most good stories, tell it simply. I was born in New York City, the first of 3 daughters, to parents who had migrated from South to New York in 1949. I arrived just 1 month after that move. So I grew up in the North in a Southern home with the language and foods of the South and with the storytelling. My parents had many stories about Robbinsville, Mississippi. They'd spent the first 20 years of their lives as sharecroppers in that sleepy backwater town. As a shy child, I was always in the corner listening with big ears to the tales of fishing for catfish on the muddy levee, finding dewberries in the woods, and of course picking cotton, because they were cotton farmers. My father liked the South. My mother never did. I inherited my love of books from my mother, who was never able to completely satisfy her hunger for reading. The public library was off limits for Black people in those days, and as tenant farmers, her family did not have the luxury of buying books. So after working with her own family in their fields, she took her spare time on Saturdays to hire herself out in someone else's fields for the day. She made 50 cents for a day of labor, and at the end of the month, she had $2, which she used to write book clubs and obtain her reading material. She made a vow to herself that none of her children would be born in the South, and she kept that promise. My parents were not naive, though. They didn't think that moving from Mississippi to New York would end racial discrimination, and my mother felt that at least the public libraries would be open to her children. Before my sisters and I were even able to read, she would take us on trips to the library and say, "Do you see all these books? As soon as you're able to write your name, all these books will be yours. For 2 weeks, but still yours." I grew up believing that books were more than books. They were passports to a world that held endless possibilities. The library became to me a sacred place that I used like a shrine to read, to think, and to dream. And what I dreamed was that one day I too could be a writer. It would be a long and winding road before that dream was realized. I was a shy adolescent, and my mother noticed that I was not talking. She was sure that there were things which I must have been questioning in my early teens, the changes in my body, the changes in the world around me. But I would just sit quietly in my room and read. So she went out one day and brought home a white plastic diary from Woolworths, the kind with the flimsy lock that your sister could open with a safety pin. She told me, "Gloria, I'm sure that there are things going on with your body that you don't understand, things around our home that you don't understand. And since you can't seem to find the words to talk to your father and me about these things, why don't you write them down in here?" She was wise enough to drop the diary on the bed and not press the issue. I was like any 12 or 13-year-old. If my parents wanted me to do something, I would give that activity the kiss of death. I picked up that diary and began to write. I wrote about all of the things that I didn't seem to have the words to talk about. None of it was earth-shattering, my adolescent fears and hopes, but it was important to me. I wrote and wrote. When I'd fill that diary, I wrote on spare paper in the back of my loose-leaf notebooks, on stray tablets around the house. Those journal entries turned into poems, and those poems turned into short stories. Sometimes I would read them to my parents, but for the most part, they stayed hidden in my dresser drawer. A pattern had been set that shaped the rest of my life. If you can't say it, write it. It was 1968 when I finished high school. To my parents' chagrin, since I was their brightest child, I didn't go on to college. My parents, who in New York worked blue-collar jobs, my mother a telephone operator, and my father a motorman for the New York City Transit, held hopes that their daughters would at least finish high school, something they were not able to do. They also held out hopes that one or two of us would possibly go on to city college. If we became teachers or nurses, that would have been fine then. They wanted us to be independent and trained us that way. Your race or your gender was no excuse for not succeeding. If you hit a roadblock, get up and bounce back. If you hit a wall, jump higher. The world owed you nothing but a chance. And even the slimmest chance was enough an opening to somehow squeeze through and make your mark. We were raised to believe that no one was better than we were just because of skin color. Regardless of what the world may say, what you tell yourself is all that matters. And if you tell yourself that you're a failure, then that is what you are. The country was in turmoil around me, with the civil rights movement and the anti-war protests. And like so many in my generation, I hope to make a difference in the world. I didn't see politics as the way for me. So instead of joining a Black activist group or becoming a hippie, I joined the Jehovah's Witnesses. They spoke about a theocratic government being the only solution for mankind's problems. The roots of the present unrest ran deep and long into history. And the only way to fix the world was to prepare for the coming of God's government. I threw myself wholeheartedly into this organization and became a missionary. My preaching activities took me to North Carolina and Florida, and I found that I enjoyed living in the South. The pace was slower and the people more laid back than in the North. My father's parents had remained in the South until the 1960s, and my moving there brought back memories of visiting my grandparents in the summertime. I had a cousin, Darlene. We were always in some sort of mischief, running barefoot through my grandmother's garden and breaking into her tomato plants, begging pennies from my grandfather to spend at the corner store for Mary Jane's or Tootsie Rolls. Always I remember the smells, the thick smoky air, the fresh grass after a shower, the feel of the warm dust between my toes. I was in my 20s when I returned, and I no longer ran barefoot on dusty roads, but in my memory I always would. And that was to remain the South for me. After 2 years of preaching in the South and 7 in the organization, I left the Jehovah's Witnesses. But I don't regret those years. They brought me out of my shyness by giving me a greater cause to focus on than my own self-consciousness. Those years also taught me to care about people. More importantly, they taught me that it's okay to march to the beat of a different drummer. Jehovah's Witnesses see themselves as being outside of all present governments. like the traditional Quakers. They are pacifists. They don't go to war. They don't salute the flag. They believe that Easter and Christmas are religious holidays with pagan roots, so they don't celebrate them. I became used to being different. And quite honestly, a part of me enjoyed being a rebel of sorts. I drifted away from that religion because I woke up one day to realize that I had only a high school education with no marketable skills. I wanted to go to college, and they didn't encourage it in those years. It was 1975, and the theocratic government I'd hoped for was still not there. My decision to leave the Jehovah's Witnesses wasn't an easy one, and it happened over time. They gave you more than a religion, they gave you a fellowship. Slowly, I had to replace friends, build for myself a value system. It took a while for me to see that even though I didn't belong to a church, I was still a spiritual person. I still had worth. I entered college in a nursing program. My middle sister was a nurse, and it was a field my mother had hopes of entering before she'd settled into raising a family. But I found myself spending more time on my English classes than my nursing classes. I had never stopped writing, even as a missionary. I transferred over into a liberal arts program and chose English as my major. This choice took me to Brooklyn College and introduced me to creative writing classes. I felt as if I had finally come home. One of my creative writing professors held the position that in order to write good literature, we must first read good literature. One of the books we were required to read was Toni Morrison's The Bluest Eyes, or The Bluest Eye. It was my first book by a Black woman. It tells the story of Pecola Breedlove, the little Black girl who believed that all of her problems and her family's problems would be solved if she only had blue eyes. Pecola's search for blue eyes eventually drove her insane. This book spoke to me like none had before. It was about my beauty, my right to have a place in the world in spite of dark skin and kinky hair. It read like pure poetry. I went on to discover that other Black writers at Brooklyn College, to discover a whole history of Black writers even as far back as slavery times, when it was illegal to teach slaves to read or write. It slowly dawned on me that I had a history in America. I yearned to add my stories to the legacy. This knowledge gave me the authority to pick up the pen. That very semester, I began writing short stories about a little street that was walled off from the rest of the town. That was home to several Black women who had come there as a place of last resort. These women differed in their skin color, from ebony to ivory. They differed in their age, their religious affiliations, their politics, and even their sexual preferences. What they held in common was Brewster's Place, a street they turned into a rich tapestry of their hopes and fears, their defeats and triumphs. I wrote The Women of Brewster's Place in my junior and senior years at Brooklyn College. It was a rough going because I was on my own and putting myself through college by working midnights as a switchboard operator in different Manhattan hotels. I wrote after finishing classes and on my 2 days off from the job. I couldn't write on the job, but at 3 or 4 in the morning after the guests were mostly in bed, I would edit the work I had done at home. Switchboard operators were my first audience. I read sections of the book to the woman who relieved me in the mornings. My supervisors were mainly Irish and Polish women who took great pride in the fact that I was going to school and to make something of myself. They arranged my schedule as much as they could to accommodate my classes. As a rule, older students make better students, and I was no exception. I used my time well at Brooklyn College. It took me 7 years because some semesters I could only go part-time. I ended up with a grade point average of 3.8 out of a possible 4.0. My original game plan after graduating was to get my doctorate in American Studies and then teach while I continued to write. hoping for tenure or a high-class union card, as I called it. I was offered a full scholarship to Yale University. With one book under my belt, I entered those strange waters. I didn't have the culture shock so many students did because I was 31 years old. I knew what I was about, getting the best grades possible with the right recommendations to attain a professorship someplace. But graduate school was competitive. I realized I would have to put my writings on hold if I wanted to compete with the intensity needed to meet my goal. So I decided to leave after 2 years with my master's in hand and devote myself to writing full time. My whole family turned out for that graduation, my parents and sisters, my niece and nephew, aunts and uncles. They were understandably proud of me, but I couldn't have been more proud of them. There they were, school bus drivers, cleaning matrons, transit workers, and factory workers, all turned out in their best as we went from Dean's tea to social mixers. I wanted everyone to know that these were the people I came from. These were the shoulders I stand on. My father told me in a quiet moment, you know, when I was growing up, the thought that one of my children would graduate from Yale seemed as likely to me as men walking on the moon, and I've lived long enough to see both. My first novel, The Women of Brewster's Place, won the National Book Award. It put me on the literary map and helped me to get teaching jobs as I wrote my other books. I taught a lot in those early years because although my books were critical successes, they didn't become bestsellers. I didn't mind though, because I was doing what I loved and making a living at it. I knew that made me one of the blessed few on earth, and I like to think I accepted that blessing with grace. I threw myself into my novels. If they needed research, I did research. If I needed to travel, I traveled. I did whatever my characters and the situation warranted because, after all, they entrusted me with these stories. It was while I was doing research for my third novel, Mama Day, that I discovered St. Helena Island. It is one of the barrier islands that sits off the coast from North Carolina to Florida. Collectively, these are called the Sea Islands. And they hold a different history and topography from the rest of the South. They were home to the Gullah people, though who were brought there as slaves. They were separated from the mainland during slavery days. They developed a distinct language and culture of their own. Originally fishermen, farmers, and basket weavers, the Gullah are a dark-skinned and regal people who are trying to hang on their culture as their young cross the bridges to resettle around the United States. The young people leave and the developers come. They are drowned by the warm winters and the live oaks dipping with Spanish moss, the palmettos fringing, the salt marshes that extend for miles, weaving in and out of strips of land that lie below a blue and welcoming sky. You feel more like you're in the Caribbean than in America. There is a stillness about the place, the sandy soil under your feet, the gentle marsh breezes coming from the east, all seem to speak of eternity, of quiet, of calm. I walked those dusty lanes, originally in search of a character, and slowly realized that I had found a place where I wouldn't be afraid to die. Most people have heard of Hilton Head, but that island is far removed from St. Helena. In Hilton Head, the palm trees have been cultivated to stand in straight lines like soldiers. Shopping malls abound, and the white sandy beaches are hidden from view by concrete highways. A paved 2-lane highway also runs through St. Helena, but as it makes its way over the bridge from Beaufort to end up at Fripp Island, it is surrounded by salt marshes, tomato fields, and live oaks. You feel that people live on St. Helena, not just tour it. When my research was finished, I made a promise to myself that I would return. I also decided that if I made any money from the current novel, I would mortgage my life to the bank and buy a retirement home. I kept that promise, and in 1988 found a little black and white Victorian cottage on 2 acres of land. The property sat on the edge of St. Helena Sound with 300 feet of beachfront. The down payment emptied my savings account, but I didn't care. The property was my own little Eden. I would sit at a folded table in the sunroom that gave me a view of the water, drinking my morning coffee in a pink mug that said "Hers" in blue lettering. That table, with its one chair and that mug, were my only possessions besides a trailer camping bed that I picked up secondhand, but this, indeed, was mine. I looked over at the plantation house and thought about how things had come full circle. My people once worked this land as slaves, and here I was, owning part of it. I soon learned that old houses carry old problems. Over the years, pipes broke, the roof leaked, and termites invaded. I hadn't given full thought to how I was going to maintain the grounds, as important consideration since 1.5 of my acres had caterpillar grass that grew abundantly in that warm climate. I couldn't stay in St. Helena. I had to return to New York and make a living to keep my mortgage payments on time. I used the house as a refuge, going down 2 or 3 times a year when I wanted to unwind. It seemed that on each trip there was something new to be fixed. Perhaps my biggest surprise was coming down one year and finding a tree rat dead and laid out on my kitchen floor. It had probably eaten the poison put down for the field mice that seemed to sense the house was empty, so migrated inside each winter. Did I regret my decision? Sometimes. Did I feel that it was one of the luckiest women on earth? Sometimes. There is always a love-hate relationship with a charming old house. Just when you feel that you're ready to throw in the towel, one of the numerous workmen will comment, "What a great place you've got here." And your heart answers, "Yeah, it is." I learned patience the hard way. Sea Island time is not New York time. Regardless of the crisis, the plumber would say over the phone, "No problem. I'll be there tomorrow." I learned to pin them down to the tomorrow of this week, not the next. I tried to make the house perfect, solving all the glitches on one visit, so that on the next I could walk in and out without speaking to a single roofer or electrician. I could just take down my Hers coffee mug, put my feet up, and swing on the porch swing, forgetting time. I came to learn that the only perfect thing about my home was the massive oak that stood in the front yard. It was at least 300 years old and swept the ground with its ancient branches. I named her Old Beauty. If trees didn't have genders, too bad. This one did. Staring at the tree gave me hope. If she had lasted that long and was still fighting, surely I could manage the next 40 years with patience and resilience. I grew to make peace with the fact that replacing a rotten beam under the back porch was the price I paid for catching my breath in all of flowering camellias in the winter and blazing azaleas in the early spring. I promised myself that one day I would ride in it. Excuse me. I promised myself that one day I would ride in it. My chance came 7 years after buying it. Almost every winner believes there is a big book in him or her, and mine was to be a historical novel that I had researched for and had traveled as far as Norway and Senegal to prepare myself. I then had 4 books under my belt, but this 5th one was it. It was 1996, and I cleared up my affairs in New York in order to return to St. Helena to write my book and fulfill another dream, making a garden. I'd collected gardening books since I had bought the house and had been waiting for the right time to devote a whole growing season to the project. There was an old greenhouse on the grounds that had fallen into disrepair over the years. I cleaned it up, replaced missing or broken glass panes, and replaced the growing lamps running the length of the shed. I decided to start my garden from seeds. I cleared out a spot on the side of the house that was 30 feet by 20 feet. I took out all of my seed catalogs, began a gardening journal, and went to town, literally. It took several trips in my rented red pickup truck to bring back enough bags of manure, potting soil, and hummus. What they lacked at the local Walmart, I ordered from my catalogs. I wonder how many people actually get a chance to act out their fantasies. I was one of them, and I can say the feeling is one of complete and utter peace. I would sit at the folded card table in a second floor room that I used for a study and look at my 20 by 30 patch of tilled soil, feeling there was nothing more in the world that I needed. Literally nothing. I had my writing. I had my 2 acres of land fronting a shoreline. I had my good health to keep it all going. The only thing I didn't have was a way to keep those damn cats out of my garden. There was a strange woman the neighbors called the cat lady, who had moved into a brick split-level ranch just across the road from me. She had at least 12 cats. They weren't house pets, but roamers. Over the years, I'd see them perched up in my oak tree or walking back and forth across the road. I didn't mind until they started using my garden plot as a litter box. At first, I appealed to their owner's good nature. I baked a batch of peanut butter cookies and took them over to her one evening. When I rang the doorbell, she peeped at me from behind the lace curtains at her front window. There was no denying that she was home because her car was parked in the driveway. I rang again, and she finally came to the door and opened it a crack. "I'm your neighbor from across the road," I said to her, "and I thought you might like these." She opened the door fully, and I was astounded by her size. She was a good 6 feet tall with brunette hair and exceptionally pale skin. She slouched a little in the way that tall women do from a lifetime of trying to cover their height. She didn't invite me in, and I didn't ask to come in. I just explained the problem I was having with her cats, and she told me that she would fix it. They were probably used to no one being at my place, she told me, and they began to take it as their own. She tried to keep them in the house from now on, if I would please just leave her alone. I didn't think I was being that much of a bother, but like I said, she was a strange woman. The next week, I didn't see the cats at all. Then one Sunday, when I went out to mark off my garden for the new seed beds, there was a huge pile of cat dung in the middle of the section I had planned for my tomatoes. I cleaned it up without saying anything. The next day, I did the same. I became obsessive with my cat dung patrols. Each morning before my coffee, I'd go out to check, and each time I discovered a clump. It was like a Pyrrhic victory. Aha! Again, I'd think. Whenever I saw one of the stray cats on my property, I'd run downstairs from my study and scare it away. There was one, a gray tailless minx, whose size rivaled that of a medium-sized dog, that I found especially troubling. It was certainly the right size to be the culprit for leaving such large piles in my garden soil. It was late January, and I dreaded the moment for setting out the tomato and pepper plants thriving in my greenhouse. On my way there, I saw cat shit curled up between the leaves of my zucchini, clinging to the petals of my marigolds. I was seeing cat shit in my dreams. This had to stop. My next visit to the cat lady was without cookies. She didn't open the door this time. She spoke to me through the window. She was doing what she could, she told me, but her babies needed exercise. I suggested that she put them on a leash and walk them up and down the avenue of oaks. This, of course, did not sit well with her, nor did my contention that the huge gray cat was probably the main offender. She would keep Orwell in the house, she told me. And when I reminded her that was the same thing she said 2 weeks before, she disappeared from behind the curtains. At least I had a name for my contender, Orwell. I thought about calling the police, but I knew they'd only laugh at me. I tried to find out as much about this woman as I could from the neighbors. Her name was Eunice Simon, and she worked as a paralegal in town. She was unmarried with no children. She never spoke unless spoken to, and if she had any friends, they weren't on our side of the island. The neighbors put up fences up around their gardens and used pepper spray to discourage her cats and suggested I do the same. I stubbornly rejected their advice. It was my land and my garden. Why should I be the one to make concessions? To add insult to injury, my water heater broke down and I was faced washing up in cold water during the only 2 really cold months we had. And my tree rats decided to make a return visit to my attic. The no problem plumber took 2 days to show up, but the exterminator kept his word and came the very afternoon I called. He could put fresh bait in the attic, he told me, but it would be more effective if he could also place them underneath the house. Did I have any pets? Looking back, it seems like a small matter, and I guess I should have left the whole thing alone. But 2020 hindsight is no sight. How could I know that my answer to that question was about to change my life forever? No, I told him. I have no pets. Dick Simon is not having a good day. He spent the morning in a Senate Intelligence Committee closed session for a hearing on the latest budget proposed by his office and the National Security Agency. Why did he always have to beg those bastards for money? Didn't they understand the importance of what his agency, the NSA, was doing for their country? He heaves a sigh and spins his chair so he can look out his plate glass window onto the sprawling design of the buildings below. A virtual city lies under his gaze, with 20,000 people employed to do everything from cutting hair to frying hamburgers, to deciphering the most sophisticated codes in the world. His city. That's the way he's always thought of Fort Meade, his city. The plate glass gives him back part of his reflection. He is what could be considered a handsome man. Dark wavy hair, olive skin, and a strange cast of gray eyes that appear larger than they are behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He spins back to his desk and picks up his favorite paperweight, a snow globe, which he shakes vigorously. It usually helps him to relax, watching the white snow swirl around and around, settle and finally reveal nothing. That's what his city at Fort Meade is like, a bustle activity that doesn't really exist outside of its campus. As Assistant Deputy Director of NSA, he is second most important civilian in an organization so secretive that his very character is still classified as top secret, that his very charter is still classified as top secret. Its employees, whether cutting hair or deciphering codes, all tell their family and friends that they work for the Department of Defense, period. Simon loves that. The ability to be there and not be there. To have privy to almost every form of communication in the world while he sits at the center, holding all those lines in the palm of his hand. Invisible. Invincible. He shakes the glass globe again. It comes in threes, is what he told himself that morning, after forgetting his badge in his car and not being allowed in the building. Harry has known him for 10 years and still wouldn't let him in. I'm going to take a break real quick right here, and I'll be right back, guys. Okay, I'm back, guys. Okay, I'm on page 16. It comes in threes, is what he told himself that morning after forgetting his badge in his car and not being allowed in the building. Harry has known him for 10 years and he still wouldn't let him in. He must remember to write a memo commending Harry for doing such a great job, regardless of how he had argued. But then again, that memo might reflect badly on him, since he should have never forgotten his badge. He cancels out the memo in his mind. Dick Simon never does anything that will put him in a bad light, regardless of how small. But it did come in threes. First the Senate hearing, then the forgotten badge, and now a message waiting on his desk from his sister, Eunice, in South Carolina. It's marked urgent. And he knows that's a damn lie. There is nothing about Eunice's life that warrants urgency. Maybe he would call her after dinner, or maybe he wouldn't. But then again, maybe one of their relatives had died. They had almost lost their mother and father several years ago, so that only left a small circle of aunts, uncles, and cousins, none of whom he likes well enough or is close enough to warrant what he call his sister any earlier than after dinner. But then again, he stops himself. He could have gone on forever with dozens of variables to entertain for the importance or non-importance of her message. That's how his mind works. It's a curse from his background in mathematics. His explanation ultimately comes down to what he feels, and Dick Simon rarely lets what he feels influence a decision. It's what is practical, what is concrete that matters. What is pending on his desk, calls to answer, memos to write, with the most important memo being a summary of his meeting with the Senate committee. He puts down the snow globe and buzzes for his secretary. Come in, Mildred. His speaking voice is low and modulated. People find themselves leaning in toward him to better hear what is only a shade above a whisper. He never raises his voice, even when angry. It takes on a stillness, a slow cadence that seems to center itself in some depth within his chest. As Mildred walks in, his long, slender fingers tent themselves in front of his face, a gesture that means he is focusing, deep in thought. Sir? Mildred stands in expectation. I want to dictate a memo, and by the way, how urgent did my sister sound? How urgent, sir? Mildred is a competent secretary, but she was the infuriating habit of repeating the last words of any request, her way of being sure she heard the whisper-like voice correctly. Yes, how urgent? I couldn't really say, Mr. Simon. She was crying this time. His face flushes slightly behind its olive tones. When Eunice makes a fool of herself, she in some ways was making a fool of him too. She searches Mildred's face for sarcasm, but only finds a deadpan professionalism. Well, he thinks, if she wasn't crying, then it definitely would be an after-dinner call. After dinner, that time of day when he's driven himself back home to his house in DuPont Circle and has shut the door on the world and all his problems. Since he's unmarried and childless, it is a time of total peace. Dinner time is when he regroups, pulls back the pieces of himself that he's torn off to give to 100 problems that make up his day. He is a gourmet cook, and so dinner ingredients are picked up fresh each evening from his favorite specialty market. Foie gras, truffles, salmon fillets, or whatever else hits his fancy. A warm plate and a chilled glass of Chardonnay separates the Dick Simon of NSA and the Dick Simon of DuPont Circle. The Dick Simon of DuPont Circle has a screensaver on his computer made up of Easter bunnies, hopping from one side of a screen to the other. A cascading group of bunnies in all the colors of the rainbow, hop, hop, hopping across his screen. It is the closest he ever comes to a sense of humor. The Dick Simon of the NSA is renowned for not having a sense of humor, and he likes it that way. He is a machine, all work and only work. But his home holds a secret about him that no one at work would ever guess. And keeping a secret from a place whose mission is breaking through secrets is gratifying. When he sits in front of his home computer that night after dinner, it gives him one and only smile of the day. After he has had the equivalent of a good belly laugh, he is ready to call his sister. It took you long enough. It was a rough day at the office, Eunice. I don't know why I bother. You don't give a damn about anything that concerns me. What is it, Eunice? Orwell is dead. My baby is gone. A cat, he thinks. She's calling me about a damn cat. Sorry to hear that, Eunice. Was it a peaceful death? He was poisoned. How do you know that? I had an autopsy. It was rat poison. Gloria Naylor killed him. Who's Gloria Naylor? A woman who lives across the road from me. And how do you know she did that? Because she hated my cats. She told me so. And she hates me too because I'm a Jew. Here it goes, he thinks. It's always come down to this. I didn't get the job. I didn't get the house. I didn't get the raise because I'm a loser. His sister is a loser, and that's the bottom line. A part of him hates her for that, for not finishing law school and ending up a mediocre paralegal. The professors hated her because she was a Jew, but when it turned out that most of them were Jews as well, what did she say then? They were self-hating Jews? They had it out for her from the beginning because of the way she looked, walked, talked, felt? Then there's a part of him that feels deeply and sadly responsible for his sister's paranoia. Because if he had been a better brother after their parents died, if he hadn't been so intent on his own career, if only. And then when she left that day, she looked back at me and I saw in her eyes and I saw in her face, Eunice, it looks like we've both had a long and hard day. Why don't you rest and we'll talk about this another time? How did I know you'd say that? How did I know that that was exactly how this conversation would end? Eunice decides to take matters into her own hands. She doesn't know why she went to Dick at all. He has never supported her. It's times like this that she misses her father desperately. Those long, slender violinist hands stoking her back and telling her that everything would be all right. Daddy would fix it. Well, for good or for bad, she doesn't have him now. She goes to her phone book, finds the number for the deputy sheriff, and dials. She wants to report some irregularities that are happening in the house across the road from her. She can't put her finger on it, but it seems like there are drugs involved. How does she know that? Well, cars are always stopping there from morning to night, and she's seen boxes being unloaded after midnight. Just a suspicion, but it bears checking out. There, she thinks, hanging up the phone. That should do it. Deputy Sheriff Miller, a slight man with balding hair, runs his hands over his head. Another call from Eunice Simon. She was always reporting irregularities. A strange car she couldn't identify, cruising past her house. A stray dog being sent by a neighbor to torment her cats. Strange noises in the middle of the night. The woman was a squirrel, no doubt about it. But he was obligated to check out any suspicion of drug dealing. It was becoming rampant on the island. What had once been a quiet place where people didn't even bother to lock their front doors was slowly becoming an armed camp. Neighborhood watch teams, alarm systems, and attack dogs were now the norm. He turns to his computer and runs the name she had given him, Gloria Naylor. It comes up with nothing, not even an overdue parking ticket. It still doesn't mean anything. There were a lot of drug users and pushers who were yet to run foul of the law. The next day, he does a little discreet investigation of the woman who lives next to the Coffin Point plantation house. The description he gets of the woman piques his interest. She's a writer. She's black. And she wears dreadlocks. Some kind of radical, that was for sure. but not necessarily dealing. Then again, how could she afford a place like that on that end of the island without some major help? He didn't pay for a place like that on welfare checks. Perhaps it will be the best to turn his slip over to the Drug Enforcement Agency. To turn this tip over to the Drug Enforcement Agency. Those DEA guys will have the means that doesn't get to the bottom of things. Those DEA guys had the means that he doesn't to get to the bottom of things. They've even been known to do a little unofficial snooping around before going back to a place with a search warrant. Miller picks up the phone and makes the call. All right, we're going to stop there for today. That's page 21, so we'll pick up on the next video. That was Gloria Naylor, and the book is 1996. Bye guys, see you next time.